And I'm really happy to introduce our speaker who is with us today. We are very honored to have her here as an expert in not only in creative industries, but also in the policy development within the creative industries sector. Ms. Dinah Caine, she's the chair of council at Goldsmiths University of London. She's a former chair of Creative Skillset and also a member of the Creative Industries Council, which brings together industry and government to develop industrial strategy, and chairs that work on the education and skills. She's also a member of the Civic Universities Commission, a panel made up of leading public servants to examine how universities can combine global achieving with serving their local communities. I think it's this very rich experience of working in creative industries and in policy. It does bring to this session a very, very important thing, because you are the person who can discuss and share a lot of knowledge in this area. So we're very, very honored to have you here today, and we'll be happy to hear your opinion and your experience in this area. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sorry. I thought you were going that way. No, okay, fine. Okay, well, a very, very good morning to you all. I'm absolutely delighted to be here at this conference, and I would really like to thank the British Council for their invitation and their very warm welcome. It's a warm welcome that in only 2 days of being in Uzbekistan, I've also experienced from everybody, and I've just been so touched and impressed by the helpfulness, the kindness, and the real sense of energy and youthfulness and vigour, actually, which must relate to those statistics we were hearing about before. Amazing to have so many young people, 37% of the population. What a resource that is. And that, of course, is what we are all here to reflect on, discuss, and think about in terms of how we can best help those young people to move forward to successful careers and successful futures in successful companies. Now, I obviously am at the other end of the age range, and my task here today is to seek to share some of what I've learnt in my career and in terms of what I have done with others in this sphere, but also to share with you some of the areas where perhaps we haven't developed as well as we might, because out of that, in any situation, comes really important learning in terms of taking things forward. To turn to my roles, just briefly to explain the structures around what they have been, because I will reflect on that in terms of what I contribute today. Creative Skillset, I was chief executive and then chair of, and basically it was an organisation that brought together the key employers, the key trade associations, the key trade unions within the industry to actually focus jointly as a very big network on issues around skills needs, training needs, and talent development. That organisation then worked in partnership with government to actually look at the policy issues that government was engaging with across the piece, and whether or not those policy issues could be fine-tuned and focused in ways that supported what the industries felt they needed. So it's an interesting concept because it flips things from necessarily this is what the government wants and needs, and then this is what industries have to do. It is more of a partnership approach, and obviously not always successful, but also very successful. And the other thing is, the organisation looked at all of those issues from, as we were discussing earlier today, really, really young preschool through to postgraduate and into the workforce. So strategic. But of course, critically, as well as a partnership between government and the industries, absolutely the interface between those needs, that analysis, and actually the partnership with training and education institutions was absolutely critical. And in fact, People First, who are here today, Kate, People's First origins lay in actually the same role within the hospitality industry. So you have two potential examples and experiences here of that kind of approach in different sectors. Now, since 2010, I've also been a member of the Creative Industries Council in the UK. As Medina said, that was a joint forum which was set up. On that council, we have two of the chairs are the Secretaries of State, one in the Culture Media Department and one in the Business and Enterprise and Industries Department. They jointly chair that with a senior leader from the industry. And so the task of that body was to look more broadly at all of the issues, all of the barriers for growth, all of the areas of growth opportunities for the creative industries to grow. So, for example, issues particular to these industries, things like access to finance, ways in which you can get support from banks, ways in which credit and other lines of finance flow, intellectual property, both its protection and its exploitation, exporting, education and skills, entrepreneurship and small and medium-sized business growth, diversity, infrastructure, including the rollout of obviously digital, but critically the address to local and regional development. And effectively, different experts from across the industries, different input from local key regions and policymakers nationally, all brought together, overall strategies developed, but then very specific addresses to these specific areas. And I have led since 2010 the area of skills and education. So can I just ask the translators, am I speaking slowly enough? Yes, is that good? Okay, good. Let me know, yeah. As well as this experience, I also have the great honour of chairing the governing board of Goldsmiths, who have been a key partner to Creative Spark. And so I will bring some of my reflections from that to this conference. So, as I said, it's an absolute pleasure and privilege to be here. Because I've come here, I've had the privilege of starting to look and read about, at a very top level, your economy, culture and society. And clearly this is a time of huge, exciting progress and change in your nation's history. And it's really impressive, I think, to see that The Economist named Uzbekistan the most improved country in the whole wide world in 2019, particularly in relation to the development of your democracy and your address to the economy. And I've also read the recent address of your president to the Senate, and have reflected on it, I hope, in order to make my contribution to your thinking more useful. I think that address shows absolute energy, scope and ambition, and particularly, I think, to rethink, to imagine, and to really focus on progress, both in your country and to learn in relation to that from what has been going on elsewhere. But also, it seems to me it requires a very, very significant culture shift in that process, and the Minister and I were just talking about that. So exciting, but a huge agenda to be working on. And there is real opportunity in that, as I will explain, because in those complete change moments, I think it's possible to think imaginatively and in ways that sometimes in more traditional countries like the UK, we tend to sometimes hold on to things. As well as innovating, we have a habit of sort of also holding on to things because it was the way things were done. So I think as well, obviously, as the ambassador said, the signing of UNESCO's General Conference in November on the creative industry is really, really important. And as you've heard, a growing sector in the world. But I really want to take us back to the UK now, because I think it's easy to talk numbers, and we can all talk numbers. The fact is, what do you do with those numbers, and what do those numbers mean? And perhaps it would be useful just for me to dwell on, for example, this cultural example, an editorial in the Times newspaper on the 11th of October. This time, the ragtag team coming to the rescue is the industry itself, and then asked, will that trend continue? So a question, actually, which shows that a leading journalist, obviously working in the creative industries, actually hadn't quite grasped yet the powerhouse that these industries are and have become, and that actually that raises questions for us in terms of the degree to which we have been able to make the case and communicate. And if I think about what are the reasons why that has happened, it is literally only 20 years since we came up with the term creative industries. And I think it was interesting before hearing the points that were made about culture and arts and industries, because the definition, and I would urge you to look at it, the definition of our creative industries encompasses very clearly the creative arts, crafts, museums and galleries, culture, as well as creative industries. And one of the things, going back to another point that was made this morning, one of the early issues I think we had, and John Newbegin, who is here and will be on the platform later reflecting on some of my contributions and contributions of his own, was very active at that point in the work around creating the understanding of what came into this category. And there was such a division between culture and industries. There was a sense in which culture was very pure. Culture was about high art, was about expert dance, as you were saying earlier, and various other things. And that the industry bit was a bit sort of capitalist, a bit making money, a bit sort of tricky. So we would talk the banner, but actually some of the conversations around what came under which heading and whether or not actually we could see ourselves as one coherent sector took cultural change and took time. And I think now we are at that stage where the ecosystem is understood, that actually very much there is an understanding that although there are differences in subsectors, culture, creative industries, and in creative industries, differences between film, between TV, between craft, between and so on and so forth, nevertheless, there are hugely important common issues that bind us as well. And it is those issues that we work on together as a council, whilst respecting that actually the practical implementation of them will vary, will be nuanced, both in relation to specific address, museums and galleries, through to fashion design, but also is nuanced in relation to locality, to region, to place, to city, because it all also has to reflect society, culture, the people, and critically it is they that need to actually own and feel absolutely involved and know that they are part of this movement around the creative industries. And I do believe that work has really helped to support some of the turbocharging of these industries, the coming together of the tribes, as I like to call it. Now, I have to go back to the Times now, And that very same day as the editorial I talked to you about, there was front page news on a number of the national newspapers, which said 5 key sectors of the economy had written a letter to government regarding concerns over Brexit. You see, I've mentioned it. They were aero, auto, chemicals, food and drink, and pharma. And between them, the coverage emphasised they employ 1.1 million people and contribute 98 million to the UK economy each year. And how, on the front pages, everybody said their views needed to be taken very seriously indeed in relation to Brexit. Now, of course, I agree that their views need to be taken very seriously indeed, but you will remember that we were those super little ragtag heroes in an editorial, whereas in fact, our sector, the creative industries in the UK, had grown by a massive 53% from 2010 to 2017. And what it brought to the British economy was more than all of those sectors put together. More. Was growing twice as fast as the average for the UK economy, and as the ambassador said this morning, faster than any other sector in the economy. So I say that to you because there is a balance sometimes, I think, between the understanding and recognition by government and policymakers, by parents, by general culture of the traditional sectors, which are boundaried and understood, and new and emerging industries like the creative industries. We have a lot of work to do to communicate and to really encourage teachers, parents, and policymakers to really understand the power and the importance of actually both responding to the new ways in which industries are morphing, but also that people understand that these areas are full of opportunity, full of employment, full of excitement, and are serious industries with serious employment potential. And I will turn then to employment figures, because in 2018, the number of jobs in the creative industries themselves stand at over 2 million. So double, remember, those sectors that I just mentioned to you, double. And 6.2% of employment in our economy. Now, that's an increase of 30% from 2011, 3 times the growth rate of employment in the economy as a whole, and it continues to grow even in these troubled Brexit times. But there are also, the ambassador, for those who are listening, said it's 3 million, and this is where the other million lie. There are also 1 million creative jobs, occupations in other parts of the economy. And when added together, you reach something like 3.2 million, and the statistic the ambassador used, which is 1 in 10 jobs across the UK, which is more than those employed in the financial sector. And we call this creative economy as opposed to creative industries, the addition of those critical occupations elsewhere. So I'm sorry if that's a lot of statistics, and you've heard some of them this morning, but I think they bear repeating, because we can think in huge global terms. The issue is, how does it all break down into Uzbekistan? And one of the great things that John did and the government in '97 was to actually say we need to gather research, and we need to gather evidence, and we need to gather statistics, both in order that we can, and I can stand here today to speak to you about the numbers, but actually arriving at those numbers and arriving at the definition around those numbers took an awful lot of time. But to have evidence is power. It's power in terms of policy and being able to speak on behalf of these industries, but it's also power in defining what you need to do. What is the makeup? What are the issues? And actually research supports all of that. And so I will come to 2 things that have differed in terms of the way our industries are structured and other more traditional industries, and why those issues actually have created some of some of, I think, the understanding problems that we have, as well as obviously some of the great opportunities. So one is, going back to entrepreneurship, the level of employment of freelancers in our industries, the self-employed, the small startups, and micro enterprises is really, really high. So with all of that employment and all of that growth, 95% of the businesses in the UK are what we call micro businesses. In other words, they employ less than 10 people. In terms of the workers in the sector, 33% are self-employed, which is compared to about 16% across the workforce as a whole. So self-employment, freelancing, makes up a really significant proportion. That then makes us atypical as a set of industries. But I believe profoundly that it's also very much the way not just work in our industries, but the future of work across the economy is going. Because what we're seeing in the 21st century is people moving from job to job, and we're seeing people having portfolio careers, and we're seeing people develop their own businesses and having to manage their own employment and their own finance. And that requires a real address to entrepreneurship, both individually, but also in relation to those companies. And it's also evidence that it's absolutely the case that small companies can really build big industries. So I think that's a very important point to share with you. However, what it also does is to make the corralling and the bringing together harder, because you're dealing with so many different players. And that's why networking, which is something Creative Spark are doing here, is so important. The bringing together, the networking, people-to-people support, and ways in which that's done is absolutely critical to moving forward on a lot of these issues. So, as I say, that can cause issues from everything to the way that national statistics are compiled, which is why I would suggest to you it's important to look at the research and evidence piece, but also to the way in which our skills and education policy is organised in the UK. Now, I want to talk just very briefly about change, because it's always difficult. Change is always difficult, I think, and culture change is very difficult. And I think that quite often as human beings, we can tend to be, and I'm using this word with a small c, conservative. We're more comfortable with what we know, what we understand, and those structures and employment practices. And I was just saying to the Minister before, although the agenda is huge, what an opportunity to be able to be looking at so many of these elements of the jigsaw at the same time, and really being able to think innovatively. And I would particularly want you to focus on creative education, because it absolutely extends beyond those working directly in the creative industries. I think it's interesting to look just at this piece, my last stat about the creative industries in the UK. 60% of those employed are in high-skill occupations, compared with 36% for the entire economy. And 65% hold a level 4 qualification or higher versus 40% in the economy. So in other words, the link between higher education and entry into these industries is very important. And those partnerships are very important. And that also has to link back to what goes on in schools and what goes on in preschools. Because creative education is more than our industries. Creative students develop highly transferable skills that lead them to creative occupations across the wider economy. But also, those skills are really important in terms of driving innovation, new thinking, fresh thinking, which is also important to changing culture and changing systemics. And that, I think, has to bring me on to something which we haven't touched on today, but the fourth industrial revolution. I am very conscious, obviously, that Mike Pompeo is in town. So I am very, very pleased that you're actually here with me listening to this. But my point is a global one in relation to the Fourth Industrial Revolution, and something that all nations need to be addressing. So, what do I mean by the Fourth Industrial Revolution? It's defined by a fusion of technologies and a blurring of the lines between the physical, digital, and biological. And particularly, I think we all are addressing at the moment the development of artificial intelligence and robotics. And as a result of that, skills demands and what all of that means for our workers now, but also for our school children now and their futures, absolutely is moving apace. And as I said earlier, that concept of careers relating to preparing for one job is falling away, and workers of the future will increasingly need those portfolio of skills. So just to illuminate, it's estimated that 65% of primary school children will be employed in jobs. So that's 65% of primary school children at school now will be in jobs that don't exist at the moment. And that, I think, is probably a slightly conservative estimate. So what do we need to do now to prepare young people, not only for the skills demands that they will face now, but that future? I think also, and this is a hard statistic to face, and this is not necessarily a comfortable one for any country, but it's predicted that half of current jobs now are at risk of automation, which also means actually that we need to address these issues not just for the younger generation that are coming through, but also for those people in the workforce now. What do we do to help support them for the impact of artificial intelligence and innovation? So I think it's widely recognised at the moment in a lot of countries, including the UK, that the response to that needs to be that more attention is focused on developing people with science, technology, engineering, maths, STEM subjects. And obviously within that, I think there's a real debate and an importance to be placed on technology, and technology equating as well very much to the development of digital skills and a digital infrastructure. And I noticed obviously that that is something that is going to be a priority in Uzbekistan, as this is the year of science, education, and also digital. But I think if we look at research, that the National Endowment for the Science and Arts in the UK, and I have been asked to link to sources of research that you can look at and reflect on, what their work has done is to find that 80% of the jobs in the creative industries and in creative occupations are at low or no risk of automation. In addition, I think creativity and its products are key to helping shape and develop actually emotional intelligence, which going forward is actually going to be as critical as the emphasis on artificial intelligence, because unless we develop artificial intelligence emotionally and in sympathy with humanity, then we are going to find ourselves in problems. I think recently Nesta also published something called the Creative Digital Skills Revolution, where they looked at 35 million job descriptions. And what that confirms, absolutely, is creativity and digital skills together are key now to what employers are advertising and looking for. So it follows that if we know that already, 35 million job descriptions already, and we can see into that future, then we need to start now addressing, combining creativity with digital skills from playground through to PhD. And it's also clear in terms of the growth in the creative industries that it's where that technology comes together with creative content that we are starting to see real growth. So Nesta's further looked into businesses, and what that shows is that business that fuse creativity, digital science and entrepreneurship skills have the higher levels of growth and innovation. And that's a study which is called Brighton Fuse, original study looking at one small city in the UK. but they have done further work which amplifies that fact. So what do we know then? Well, we don't know what the jobs are in the future. What we do know is that there's a sort of golden triangle which basically brings together creativity, innovation, and resilience. It brings together digital and other STEM skills, and it brings entrepreneurship. And effectively, if we can bring those together, those themes together, in a much more imaginative way, then that will be really important in terms of setting our next generation forward to the future. So that blending is really, really critical. And I just want to read to you a quote from Andy Haldane, who's chief economist and deputy at the Bank of England. And he also chaired our overall Industrial Strategy Council in the UK. What he says is this: the next 50 years may bring opportunities and challenges every bit as great as any in the past. The fourth industrial revolution will offer huge potential to individuals, economies, and societies. But the engine of growth may change, with artificial rather than human intelligence playing a much larger role. The creative forces unleashed will need to be carefully managed to avoid a tear in our social fabric. This is likely to require new sets of skills, with creative and social skills at a greater premium. It may require new sets of social institutions and safety nets, and it may require a reorientation of our approach to education, to training and work. The creative industries are a thriving sector of the UK economy, generating, and you know the statistics by now, I'm not going to bore you further, but in future, we may need every industry and every worker to see themselves as creative. Knowledge will not be enough. We already have a knowledge economy. In future, we will need a creative one. And then he goes on to talk about teaching creativity both in and out of the curriculum. But also, I think something somebody touched on this morning in terms of pedagogy, about the importance of starting to look at delivery which is interdisciplinary. We have tended to start to structure over the 20th century our education into silos. So if you look at the triangle I was talking about, creativity, well, we will have arts and humanities schools. Entrepreneurship sits in the business school. Digital sits in the computer schools. And finally, I think, you know, when you look at that mix, you have to ask yourself, this is not what we should be doing for this next stage. And if you start at universities separating out in that way, and you now look back and work it all the way through, certainly our school system in the United Kingdom, separation starts to increase at secondary school level and then further increase. And yet we say to people, we need you to work in teams, we need that team effort, we need to pull people together from different disciplines to make successful businesses. So you may major in one area, but an understanding of another area helps you work in those teams to drive those businesses forward. And so we, I think, have a lot of work to do in the UK to actually address some of this and to start looking at credit transfer and more interdisciplinary. And I notice with great interest, and as was discussed this morning, that is something that you are already embarking on here. And also I noticed you're looking at 6 directions of pedagogical, I can never say that word. It's terrible. I talk all the time about skills and teaching and I can't say pedagogy. Did I just say it? I said it, okay, pedagogy. I would say to you, you know, please look at that research that I've touched on. Please reflect on that. And please think about it in the broader context when you're addressing what you are going to be doing with advice and support around curriculum development at all stages. Prepare, I would say, for that longer future now, not just the future as we understand it at the moment. Hard to do, I know, easy to say, hard to do, but I think you have a tremendous opportunity to do that. I also think that across all of those areas, there are really good examples of good practice. I'm going to leave you with the quote from Nick Sirota, who's chair of our Arts Council in the UK. We must ensure every child can achieve their creative potential, whether that's as an artist, a scientist, or an engineer. Those areas, those occupations are also creative occupations. Let's remember that. We shouldn't be separating and creating difference. Our strength as a society and as a competitive economy depends on it. And I would also point, I think somebody made the point this morning, that extracurricular and youth activity is tremendously important, as well as that which goes on in schools. Alongside that, and touching on a question that was raised this morning, I think it's hugely important that you are able to look at the creative industries in Uzbekistan and think about what careers materials you are preparing and making available for people. Those fashion owners that have already made a change here, those people in roles, in jobs, we've had to do, even with the figures I'm talking about, huge amount of work on this in the UK, to actually encourage teachers and parents to understand the opportunities. And the best way to do that is near to peer. It's those who are just going into the industries, younger people who have developed businesses, younger people who are making their way. I think that is really important, as well as actually holding sessions with parents and getting some of those parents to talk about why they're encouraging their children to think about these industries and these opportunities. So, if that's the broader piece, Fourth Industrial Revolution and the economy as a whole and the importance of creative education, I will turn now to the creative industries themselves. I will get back to Creative Spark. So, as I said, I use the term creative industries to encompass culture and heritage. And I think that having the Creative Industries Council in place has been really, really important for us as a set of industries, because there are so many different moving parts. So to help understand the context of government to the industries, industries to government, is critical, I think. And to give you one example, intellectual property. Huge amount of negotiation about that, and I'm sure there's discussions here about the exploitation of and protection of, because it is core to monetization and success in these industries. And the balance between the creators and the platforms, such as Facebook, such as Google and others, Spotify, others, where do the revenue streams flow through that? Who makes the most money? What is a fair balance between them? That is absolutely vital, and literally this week, with our departure from Brexit, we've also, I think, pulled out of, or are pulling out of, I'm looking at Gerald and John, the work that's taken several years in the European Union to develop an approach to copyright. But I use that example because on the one hand, there's a lot of policy work in that, but on the other hand, from the skills and education point of view, the expert group on intellectual property has been really helpful in terms of their views on what we should be doing in terms of skills and education. And that, of course, is very important to what goes on in terms of the delivery, which in turn is important, clearly, to business growth. Equally, access to finance, banks understanding the rhythms and flows of our industries, incredibly important. And I will turn then to skills and education. So one talent pipeline, it's incredibly, absolutely incredibly critical to create one voice, one dialogue. We have, under the Creative Industries Council's key committees, I chair the schools and education one, and that brings together all of the various interests, all of the bodies that I talked about before under one umbrella. And basically, I think that we need to, thank you very much. We need to be looking both at, as I said, the national context, national policy, but critical to this is really practical examples of where areas have been developed locally in certain subsectors, bottom-up examples of how networking, working together, addressing issues, coming up with case studies and impact can demonstrate the importance of change. So in schools, at the moment, I would point you to three. The Arts Council with Durham University has just published a year and a half, 2-year long very systematic study of creativity in schools, which has looked internationally and locally. The Royal Society for the Arts has just produced art critical schools. They've looked at 6 schools, primary and secondary, that actually focus very heavily on some of the things I've been talking about and the impact that they've had. In Camden, key council area in London, they're pursuing the combining of science, technology and creativity, 40 schools, primary and secondary. I particularly like that one because I chair it. And that involves 40 employers together. I think that all of this absolutely is important, and that delivery has to, as somebody was saying this morning, also give freedom and independence to the deliverers. I think we can look at standards, we can look at that which we believe should be taught, but the way in which it is taught and the way in which it is delivered needs to be different, because that difference is also really important to creativity. We wouldn't have wanted, for example, Glasgow School of Art to be teaching the same as Goldsmiths, because we don't want artists that produce all the same work. We want difference, and we need the space for that difference. So, I will finish by saying that basically, I think a sectoral approach is important. I would suggest to you, you look at it in broader networks as well as this one. I think looking at one talent pipeline is important, and I think that this isn't just about public investment, it's about the co-investment of imagination, of human resources, and also of investment with the industries. I will finish with the words of your president, if I may. Human interests are above all. The bringing up of youth to be personalities with deep knowledge, high culture, and spirituality to transfer and build a competitive economy is key. And in those words, personally, that coming together, that acknowledgement of all of those issues, I see STEAM, I see creative education, and I see not just one creative spark, but creative sparks, plural. And I think that's the other thing. This is a great brand, and as somebody said earlier, it's not just about the work of this particular initiative, it's about the work of many of you to create the sparks that build these industries and opportunities in Uzbekistan. And certainly one of them is the critical address to entrepreneurship, which we will be spending the rest of this conference on. Let that inspire you, let it be an example of what can be achieved, and maybe think about how you can spark the same networks and conversations in other spaces and in other ways. I'm sorry I've spoken for so long, but I hope that has been useful to you. I hope it has triggered thoughts for you, and most importantly now is the feedback from the esteemed panel here and the work that you all do together for the rest of this conference. Thank you very much. It's been an utter pleasure to be with you.